to wait for the tech to catch up.
Oh, that's a secondary
That's the
explanation.
worst thing that asked me to be tech boy.
You can.
It's all right. Superb save.
Oh, there you go.
Cheers. Thanks, Andy. All right. Thank you, Andy, for the invitation to come and present to this group today. And it's great to be part of this burgeoning community of career scholars that we've got happening here in Melbourne. This image up here, is anyone familiar with where this is? Cool. This is at the junction of the Namhangang and Bukhangang rivers, just outside of Seoul, at Dumulmuri. It's one of the most beautiful and serene places that I've been to in my many visits to Korea. And it's also been the site of hot political contestation in recent times as a location of protest against Lee Myung-bak's Four Rivers Restoration Project. It's been an ongoing battleground between organic farmers and environmental activists on one hand, and developers and the municipal government on the other hand. Ostensibly, it's been a battle site over the land use in the peri-urban fringe of Seoul. And it's also symbolic of the pronounced friction between government, economy, and the environment that's evolved along with South Korea's developmental state. And this really, for me, symbolises why looking at the ROK is such an interesting environmental politics case study. Now, there's also a Melbourne connection to Dumulmuri, and a personal connection for me as well. So some of you might know that I teach permaculture at Ceres Community Environment Park in Brunswick, on the north side of the city here, as one of my extracurricular interests. Now, the Dumul Co-op, who is this organisation of farmers and activists that oversee this site here, they signed an MOU with Ceres Environment Park back in 2011 to get international support for their efforts to protect the site from development. In negotiations with the local government, they cited Ceres specifically as the kind of community development model that they want to emulate at this site. So in a very real sense, this connection with Ceres and with Melbourne was pivotal in preventing Dumulmuri from being paved over with apartments, which is what we've seen elsewhere in this area. And I'm proud to have played a small role in helping to preserve this site through my research and my connection with Ceres. In the research project I'm going to talk to you about now, I'm looking to shift the view of Korean environmentalism away from a two-dimensional focus on the conflict between environmental actors and the government-chaebol complex, by looking at environmentalism in South Korea as a three-dimensional social ecosystem. I've conducted a number of participant interviews and site visits in Korea over the past 2 years, in addition to leading a sustainability-themed study tour for La Trobe Uni students to Korea last year, which is some of the members of this group in the photo here. What I've been grappling with is the appropriate way to model Korean environmentalism as a social ecosystem. And this model is something I'm going to flesh out shortly, and it's something that I'd really love your feedback on as well. So I need to pay homage here to the scholars who pioneered work on the evolution of environmentalism in Korea. People such as Chung Jae-young and Richard Kirkby, Yoon Sun-jin and Riley Dunlap, Cho Myung-rae, Han Hee-jin, Cho Dok-ho and Michael Park, among many others. And across this work, across this literature and scholarship, there's some prominent themes that have come out. The first is the subsumption of environmental protection behind the rapid growth imperative of the developmental state model. So during the 1950s and 60s, environmental pollution was largely the result of poor sanitation. And in the top left corner, you see a series of shanties and shacks that are built along the Cheonggyecheon in Seoul. So that gives you an indication of the kind of pollution problems that would come from that kind of urban living pattern. However, as Park Chung-hee's development program gathered momentum through the 1970s, export-oriented industrialisation led to pollution clusters around new heavy industrial complexes, particularly in places like Pohang or Ulsan, where you're seeing these export processing zones start to spring up. And it's in these areas here that we see the seeds of the Korean environmental movement in the rise of localised NIMBY, not in my backyard protests by residents living adjacent to these new industrial precincts. The second theme in this environmentalism literature is the tarring of environmentalism by the government-chaebol complex with the brush of communism. So organised environmental protest was often suppressed through the government's anti-communist measures. However, environmental concerns began to assume some prominence in the democratisation movement through the 1980s because incidents of industrial pollution, including a few really prominent cases, highlighted the excesses of the military dictatorship and the corruption of the chaebol. This relationship between the democracy and environment movements still persists today, with environmental concerns being one of the undercurrents beneath the protests for the impeachment of Park Geun-hye. And I say one of the undercurrents because from my reading there's a whole host of different social issues that were bubbling under the surface of the immediate wish to get rid of the president. The third theme is the bureaucratic momentum of developmentalism that persists in shaping the discourse and the policy formulation around environmental politics. So while environmentalism and environmental organisations became professionalised through the late 90s and early 2000s, the logic of developmentalism continues to shape policy making and official discourses around environmental issues. This has been a limiting factor on the efficacy of environmental organisations, such as the Korean Federation of Environment Movements, such as Green Korea United and a number of others, who are attempting to lobby government and participate in the policy-making process. So through that lobbying process, they have to engage through the discourse of developmentalism, which is not strictly where they want to be, but that's the language of the policy game as it stands now. However, we're now in a period where we need to evaluate Korean environmentalism as more than just a reaction to the pollution excesses of the developmental state. It's part of change processes that are happening at global scale with global scope and that are coming to define the politics of the 21st century everywhere, so not just in Korea. And that's one of the reasons why I'm finding this research so interesting, because there's certainly lessons from the Korean case that will be applicable everywhere, as well as unique characteristics of Korean environmentalism that are local to place. So let's consider this historic moment that we're living at this time from a global big picture perspective. And I promised visually rich charts, and I'm coming through with that. So earlier this week, if you've been following the news, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a very sobering report arguing that globally we've got about 10 years to complete the greenhouse mitigation measures to limit the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, or risk climate change impacts that are potentially civilization threatening in scale and scope. Sorry. I know it sounds...
Terrifying.
Yeah, that language sounds ridiculous, but if you've been following the science, it's dead on. And
it's myth, it's not true.
How
Of
big
your
I'm doing something
imagination.
about it.
It's a leftist plot.
Yeah, I mean, that's our ability to engage with that kind of news that's a limitation, and that relates to this process that I'm going to describe here. This sustainability transition process, the 1.5 degrees Celsius upper limit for temperature rise, is like now a political and ecological marker that will increasingly inform how we respond to the global ecological crisis, wherever we happen to be on the planet. Now, if human societies are to successfully navigate this crisis, we'll need to fundamentally transform established modes of production, consumption and exchange, as well as associated social, cultural and technological systems, so that human societies are properly sustainable. And by sustainable, I don't mean the greenwash version that governments and businesses like to talk about. I'm talking about the hard sustainable model where societies don't exhaust more resources than ecosystems can regenerate on a regular basis, and that don't undercut the ecological preconditions for our existence. So as illustrated on the slide here, this effort to achieve societal sustainability is more than a technological problem, and it's more than just a political task, but it's all-encompassing, an effort that can be seen as a collection of interrelated and interdependent change processes, hence all of the relationship connections you see there in the diagram. And this is broadly grouped as sustainability transition. So that's the big picture perspective that's informing my analysis of the Korean environmental movement and environmental projects, politics in this case. So my contention is that sustainability transition in Korea is an evolving three-dimensional ecosystem of actors that include but are not exclusive to traditional environmental organisations. So what does this have to do with a marine ecosystem, you might ask? Well, just like all of the different species in this ecosystem diagram that you see here, each of the actors in Korean environmentalism plays an important role in the evolution of the sustainability transition process as a whole, like they were constituent species within that social ecosystem. So with that in mind, I'm guided by the following research questions. What is the social ecology of South Korean environmentalism? Who does what, where, and why within this ecosystem? And what does this tell us about the sustainability transition process in South Korea? And what's the relationship to broader global patterns of sustainability transition of what's happening in the South Korean environmental social ecosystem? So here's where we get to the analytical model. If we're going to look at Korean environmentalism as an ecosystem, we need a systems perspective to make sense of its functionality. And here we're drawing on complex systems theories. So complex systems thinking encompasses a collection of theories derived from the hard sciences, which take whole systems as their unit of analysis. There's an emerging literature applying complex systems theories in the social sciences and in international relations, which is my home discipline, including work by scholars like Erica Cudworth and Stephen Hobden, Thomas Homer Dixon, Ben Ramalingam, Walter Clemens, Robert Jarvis, and many others. To briefly conceptualise this perspective, systems are not analysed as unitary actors, but rather as dynamic entities whose behaviours are the result of interplay between their constituent elements, as well as themselves being constituent parts of larger systems. So if you think about an analogy is the Russian dolls, where you pull one open and there's another one inside. That's the kind of thinking that we're seeing here. So it's a holistic and integrative way of looking at the world. And importantly, it's the relationships between the elements in the system and between the system and its environment that are of central importance here, rather than just the properties of the elements of the system themselves. So if those elements are actors within South Korean environmentalism, it's the relationship between those actors that's key, rather than the characteristics of those actors themselves. So let me explain what this means in the context of the Korean case. So if the whole system we're examining is environmentalism in Korea, then the constituent elements of that system are all the actors and organisations that are working on sustainability transition. So on the slide here, I've included a number of NGOs, think tanks and social enterprises that constitute elements in the ecosystem of Korean environmentalism. Some of those names may be familiar, some of them may be not, and they're ranging in scale from local to international. For the sake of brevity, though, this is very much an abridged list. So if we're taking an ecosystem view, that means we have to consider all of the actors operating in the sustainability transition space, not just environmental NGOs or civil society organisations. So that system view would include international organisations, it'd include government bodies, it'd include business and corporate actors, it would include social enterprises and academic institutions and think tanks, all as constituent species of this social ecosystem. And we could even include prominent individuals, depending on how fine-grained we want our analysis to go. Now, the objective is to construct a network map of how all of these actors are linked together and how they interact as elements within the social ecosystem of Korean environmentalism. So when I complete this network map, and this work is still at an initial stage, so there's not as much detail here as I'd like, but that final network map will look something like this diagram here. As the lines between the dots in the graphic suggest, the forms through which Korean environmentalism takes shape will emerge from the relationships between those actors. And for each of those relationships, I'm looking for a number of different things that help to flesh out what this relationship looks like. So we're looking for evidence of how actors work or don't work together, what's called synergy in the systems literature. I'm looking for flows of money or resources, for people-to-people linkages, and for shared framings and environmental ontologies. Here we're moving beyond the structure versus agency dichotomy by integrating the unique cultural dynamics as well as the unique relationships to place that shape the interactions between the actors in the network, drawing a little from the Deleuzian concept of assemblage that political geographers would be familiar with. Now, as we do this, we can observe not only the key nodes of power in the network, so the nodes are the circular dots there, but also the key pathways of power, influence and innovation across the network. And those pathways are what will shape the emergent forms that Korean environmentalism takes as the sustainability transition progresses. So with our network elements and relationships charted, we can then map out which actors in the ecosystem are actively involved in each dimension of the sustainability transition and how they coalesce to shape each element of the sustainability transition. So to briefly flesh this out, a social ecosystem map could help us answer questions like some of the following, and I'll give a couple of examples from observations I've made in fieldwork. So one question would be, which actors have operationalised the hard definition of environmental sustainability, and what possibilities exist for the proliferation of this practice in the Korean context? Well, the Korean Federation of Environment Movements are the most prominent environmental organisation driving hard sustainability values. It's enshrined in their ethics and their charter, and as an umbrella organisation for a number of different groups, they've got quite significant reach. Where are ecocentric rather than anthropocentric approaches to environmental politics taking root in this context? One example I've come across is Hansalim, which has a model of organic agriculture and producer-consumer cooperatives, which is world-leading. It's the largest organic agriculture co-op in the world. And it has a strong focus on ecological restoration within its operating model, which its farmers adopt. What innovations are being developed at an enterprise level and an economy-wide level to internalise the externalised costs of environmental harms? Well, at a national level, South Korea's carbon pricing mechanism is an excellent example, and it's a timely example given that the Australian government had one of these and gave it up in 2013. But given that Korea is one of our largest trading partners, and many of our other trading partners are bringing carbon prices in, this is something that Australia will pick up again at some point in the future. I can guarantee that. But what kind of alternative economic and developmental models are emerging with hard sustainability in mind? At a local level, you've got places like Seoul Innovation Park, which are combining social enterprise models with green tech and holistic design. There's sharing economy initiatives emerging, including partnerships between Seoul City Hall and a number of social enterprises. Although I have to stress that these kind of initiatives are very nascent at this time, and they're still getting off the ground. What forms of political agency are most effective in creating pressure on the political system to internalise the logic of sustainability in the policy-making process? This is a big question. So at the grassroots, the anti-park protests demonstrated the potential of an engaged citizenry in South Korea, although such numbers have never been mobilised in Korea for environment-based protests. From an institutional perspective, we've seen Seoul Mayor Park Won-sun has instituted citizen participation initiatives, though these remain low level and nascent as well. But this is an important question. What kind of politics is going to be able to drive sustainability transition moving forward? I think it's a key question, given the urgency of what's been put out in the IPCC report. Related to that is what kind of organisational structures are most appropriate to driving sustainability transition. And some of the evidence from other contexts around the world is that big hierarchy is not necessarily the best model or the most resilient model in the face of environmental threats. So what I've seen are community-run cooperatives emerging in Hongdong village, not far away from Asan, just south of Seoul, which demonstrate a participatory, locally run model of service provision that's community-led rather than being part of a big government-run bureaucracy. What kind of cultural adaptations are needed for the sustainability transition? Well, if we look at other examples worldwide, a devolution of decision-making to local levels and empowering people on the ground to make decisions is generally considered part of best practice resilience thinking. How does that stack up with Korean big bureaucracy? How does that stack up with Confucian hierarchy and cultural norms? That's a question for discussion in this case, I think. What kind of technological innovations are being developed to facilitate sustainability transition? Well, I think green technology is an area where South Korea is doing very well. From smart cities to waste-to-energy transfer plants to bioremediation of old industrial era sites. There's a lot going on in the green tech space in the Korean context. But most importantly, how are all of these sustainability transition innovations and adaptations interlinked? That's the pivotal next question that this research will start to tease out as we get this network map more clearly constructed. So yeah, that's me this year at the Sore wetlands just near Incheon. So what I've described is a small sample of the emergent forms of sustainability transition practice that are coming out of this environmental social ecosystem in South Korea. It's my contention that the sustainability transition is going to rapidly become one of the defining drivers shaping politics and society, not just in Korea but around the globe in the coming decades. So as the abrupt interface we see up here between the built urban space and the marshland ecosystem suggests, Korea's unique story of economic development, democratisation, and its unique environmental vulnerabilities make a poignant case study for sustainability transition. And there's likely to be lessons from this case that can be applicable elsewhere as well. So just to wind up, this presentation's been a snapshot of an ongoing project, and your feedback is most welcome. So really interested in any questions or comments you've got to provide. So thank you.
But my question now is for Ben. I don't want to always take things back to North Korea, but I'm going to right now. So I'm curious about, I recognized a couple of those names as having done some projects in North Korea. I think Green Korea Unity or something like that. So I was wondering if in these talks about sustainability, if there is any kind of reunification slant or any people that are looking at it from a perspective, kind of looking at both Koreas at the same time, or is that just not really a part of this conversation? How does the kind of divide of Korea play into this at all, if it does?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, it is part of the engagement conversation now because of what's happened this year. That's opening up possibilities for green engagement projects, which people have been arguing about in favour of for a long time. There were plans in Lee Myung-bak's administration for people who wanted to do this kind of work. But then he went out of power, Park Geun-hye came in and was deemed too political. Any form of engagement under that administration was far too politicised. So that got parked on the shelf. So now there's plenty of organisations who are interested in reforestation projects, who are interested in agricultural capacity building, stuff as simple as creating seed banks, or working on soil fertility projects, things like that. So that I think we'll start to see these projects be implemented, and the fact that that kind of work was mentioned explicitly in the Pyongyang Declaration, I think is a signpost that we'll start to see that space open up for green engagement.
Yes, Ryan?
I have a question for Ben and a question for Jess. Ben, I was just interested in something you mentioned really briefly in your presentation, which was the kind of the attitudes towards environmentalism as kind of being linked to anti-communism, and I was wondering if there are still residues of that in the modern environmentalist movement. And then for Jess, I was interested in if I think you mentioned there were 5 adopted men that you interviewed, and I was interested in any sort of gender differences that came up, because it seems predominantly women that you interviewed. Why was there such a disparity, and if there are any thematic differences between those two groups?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan, for that question. That's a really good one. I remember speaking with Chuni Kim from KFEM. I think she's now head of that organisation. And like a number of senior figures in the environmental movement, now they were student activists back in the 1980s. So their environmental work was part and parcel of what was going on in that era. Although I don't think, that anti-communism now is not nearly as virulent as it was back then. But there's still the suspicion that if you've got environmental leanings, then you must be a little bit left-wing. A little bit on that side. And that's not something that's strictly unique to Korea. It's a feature of our culture wars here in Australia as well. But what I think we'll see now is that environmentalism won't be viewed as part of the left-right spectrum increasingly, and that will melt away because either policies or business practices or modes of living are either sustainable or they're not. And there's lots of different ways along the left-right spectrum that you might get to that goal, but it's not an ideological issue in the same way that it would have been viewed back then. But I think there's still a long way to go for us to get to that point. So, I'm really interested to see how that evolves, that ideological shift evolves in the Korean case, because the anti-communist drive was so extreme under the dictatorship period.